Alright, welcome. Today, I'm going to show you all how I made another fully custom macro pad. So, quick story on how I got here. I was going through my Instagram stories when I saw that my friend Smollchungus.mk had shared a sneak peek of a macro pad, the small pad. Now, you know the instant that I saw it, that I hit him up to yoink myself a PCB, and after a little bit of back and forth, he agreed to send me out one just a couple of days later, as well as sending me some step files, which is always really helpful when designing. So, with the PCB in the mail, the step files downloaded, I designed a new case. The original one is kind of a heart shape and was a Valentine's Day commission, but I decided to go a bit of a different direction. So, I ended up with this. It is a 3-part case with a bottom, which has a cutout for the USB-C connector, and 2 smaller pockets for some screw inserts. A middle, which will house the PCB and will be made out of solid brass, a channel first, and the top, which will hold the switches. I'm really happy with this design. While it's not the heart shape of the original, I think it has a really nice, almost Art Deco feel to it. So, with the design finished, and the toolpath set up, which this time around were a bit more tricky, since I had to machine 2 sides instead of just one, it was time for the CNC. I mounted the blank to a fixture on the CNC, and cut the first side with a 6mm bit, which is where the USB-C connector and screw inserts are. Then, once that was done, I unscrewed the blank, added some painter's tape to the fixture and the wood, and joined them both with some super glue. After that, I had to clear some space off the top, since the wood blank we had was much larger than the actual pieces. Then, cutting in the space for the switches, screw heads, and cutting the outer contour. And now it was time for a tool change. To get those perfect rounded edges, I decided to use an 8mm ball bit, which, as the name suggests, has a ball-shaped end. With that done, all that was left was to use a 2mm bit to make the holes for the screws and cut in the corners to get a sharper fit. Moving on now to the brass, which was a first for me and this channel. I got a piece of 5mm thick machining brass and mounted it to the CNC with the same tape method I used for the wood. I also put a cardboard box around the whole operation, since this machine isn't really set up for metal work and brass chips are like tiny needles that will make your life a whole lot more painful. So, using the same 6mm carbide bit with very small cuts, I let the machine do its work. Starting with the space for the PCB, then cutting a space for the outer USB connector, the outer contour, and finally switching to a 2mm bit to make the holes for the screws. Now, all was going well when we ran into an issue. I knew this was a possible concern from the start, but what had happened is that the brass heated up so much because of all of the cutting that at the very last step, which was cutting the holes for the screws, the adhesive melted and the piece got loose. Luckily, the piece didn't get ruined. I just had to use a drill to make the hole a little bit wider, and that was it. So, with all of the parts finally cut, I got to sanding. Starting with the wood pieces, with some 600 grit sandpaper, and working my way up to 1000. Once they were nice and smooth, I added some linseed oil, which is my preferred finish. Putting the wood parts aside for now, I could start work on the brass piece. I started with some 800 grit wet dry sandpaper and added some water, since that keeps the dust out of the air and helps the paper last longer, slowly increasing the grits until I reached 2000. After which, I used the buffing wheel with some polishing paste to give the piece a nice shine, which was actually quite difficult to find since I was traveling, but in the end it all worked out. Then I used some slightly less aggressive polishing compound and a microfiber cloth to give the piece a nice final polish. I did the same for the two brass screws, sending them up to 2000 grit and giving them a quick polish. Let's get to the PCB. It arrived in just a couple of days, and I decided again to use some Momax sockets to make it hot swappable. So I installed all of the sockets onto the switches and soldered them into place. So that's all of the work done on the electronic side, and I had just one more thing to do on the case, which were the screw inserts in the bottom part. Now here I messed up again. The holes were too big and the inserts would just fall out instead of screwing into the wood. So a couple of drops of super glue onto the sides and I could screw them into place, knowing that they wouldn't fall out. So, before I get to the final assembly, let me just quickly mention the switches and keycaps I used, which are the Keywerk X Pushy, a channel favorite by now, I'm sure, and some dummy key white on black double shot ABS keycaps. I am going to leave you now for the montage. If you enjoyed this, consider subscribing. And if you want to see any other macro pads getting a redesign or class up, just let me know down below. Alright,